Hello, fellow law nerds. Welcome to another summer session of Boom Lawyered, a Rewire News Group podcast hosted by the legal journalism team that believes that pregnant people deserve reproductive autonomy. Full stop. I'm Rewire News Group co-chief content officer, Imani Gandhi.
And I'm Jess Piccolo, Rewire News Group's other co-chief content officer. Rewire News Group is the one and only home for expert repro journalism that inspires you to support the pregnant people in your community. And the Boom Lawyered podcast is part of that mission. So a big thanks to our subscribers and a welcome to our new listeners.
And viewers, because Boom Lawyered's back on video, baby. I'm so excited about that.
Oh, it's so good to be back on video. I get to
really
see
is.
Imani's lovely face all the time when we record, but you all haven't. And now this is just such a treat.
You're welcome.
You are welcome. All right, let's get into it, though. We've got a meaty episode. So during summer sessions, Imani and I take a look at some of the biggest legal issues of the zeitgeist and break them down with the help of a guest each episode. This week, we are digging into Imani's favorite topic, the 14th Amendment.
The 14th Amendment. I love the 14th Amendment. This is my sweet spot. I love talking about the 14th Amendment, and longtime listeners of the show know that I like to call it a black-ass amendment, right? It is a Reconstruction Amendment. It was written after the Civil War to bring some semblance of parity between white folks and, the blacks, as Sam Alito so charmingly refers to us. But now conservatives are pushing to basically rewrite the 14th Amendment so that it protects white grievance.
I mean, that's the truth. And specifically in this episode, we're exploring the connections between the push by the conservative legal movement to upend birthright citizenship and their never-ending quest by the anti-choice movement to enshrine fetal personhood into law.
The fight over who counts as a person in this country has always been an issue. Mm-hmm. We've talked about it for years on the podcast. And it's my favorite amendment, good old number 14, that's doing a lot of heavy lifting here. On one side, you have anti-abortion activists who are pushing to grant full legal rights to fertilized eggs, embryos, zygotes, and fetuses, arguing that personhood begins at conception. On the other hand, a growing number of conservatives want to upend birthright citizenship and deny it to the children of undocumented immigrants, with the Supreme Court providing an assist in Trump v. CASA in June of this year. Both efforts twist the meaning of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection under the law and grants citizenship to all persons born in the United States. Did you hear me say that? I said born in the USA, a la Bruce Springsteen, right? Not quote unquote preborn, which is what so many anti-choicers like to say. There's no such thing as being preborn. You're either born or you're not. Today, we're talking to Lourdes Rivera, the president of Pregnancy Justice, about how fetal personhood and attacks on birthright citizenship are two sides of the same constitutional coin, and what's at stake for pregnant people and immigrants. So welcome to the show, Lourdes. We're so happy to have you here. We're just really thrilled to have you here.
Well, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
So Jess and I talk a lot about the 14th Amendment and its history on this podcast. Can you explain how the 14th Amendment fits into the push to grant legal rights, personhood, to embryos, fetuses, and zygotes?
Yeah, absolutely. And, first of all, thanks for doing this topic. I too love the 14th Amendment. And we we are Pregnancy Justice. We come across this issue every single day as we work for pregnant people across giving birth, experiencing pregnancy loss, or having an abortion. And what's happening right now, as you say, the right has been hijacking the 14th Amendment, because the end goal of the anti-abortion movement was not just to overturn Roe, even though that was a really big deal. The ultimate goal, as you say, before, during, and after Roe has been to include fetuses from the moment of conception as persons in the 14th Amendment to establish separate constitutional and legal rights for fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses. The same for living, breathing children, the same for you and me. And, they initially tried for a constitutional amendment in response to Roe, but when they failed, they pivoted to embed this really radical ideology in state law to then come back later and build a case for 14th Amendment constitutional recognition. And the impact of this is not only to ban abortion, and believe me, getting a complete national abortion ban is still a goal, But, what this practically means is that if a pregnant person is carrying what is defined as another person, then the government can intervene. It can surveil, it can punish or impose harsher penalties for any behavior, including conduct that could be perfectly legal for anybody else. And this, as long as the behavior, according to some authority, exposes the fetus to some kind of risk, whether or not there's an actual harm. And so if you're pregnant while having a substance use disorder or taking a medication prescribed by your doctor or falling down the stairs or driving without a seatbelt or at the wrong place at the wrong time and you get shot, you can get investigated and reported to family policing or charged with criminal child abuse and neglect, for example. So we're seeing more and more in this post-Dobbs, post-Roe environment that miscarriages and stillbirths, which together affect about 15 to 20% of all pregnancies, are also being increasingly treated as potential crime scenes for homicide, for murder, or things like abuse of corpse, like we saw in that case coming out of Ohio.
So when you talk about granting these legal rights to eggs, fertilized eggs, then doesn't that set up a situation where under the 14th Amendment, persons also include eggs now? And so somebody, whether it's the state or the court, has to balance the 14th Amendment rights that the born alive pregnant person, right, has versus this fertilized egg. How do we talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. And, if a pregnant person is carrying another person, right, the government can intervene to protect the person that you're carrying, which basically means that the pregnant person doesn't have any more rights. That's the way it works. It's impossible for two actual persons to occupy the same body and everybody have the same level of rights.
It's so sci-fi with such devastating consequences when you really get into it. And, on the podcast, when Imani and I have tackled this issue, one of the points that we've really tried to drive home is that under this kind of personhood rubric or framework that the conservative movement is trying to hoist on us, every failed pregnancy is a potential crime scene then, right? And you've hinted at some ways in which this idea of fetal rights is already creeping into policy conversations beyond abortion bans. But could you just say more for maybe some of our newer audience folks who are like, this is bananas. What are you talking about? Rights for zygotes. You can't be serious.
Yeah, sadly, I am serious. And there's been this expanding patchwork at the state level. And frankly, every US state and territory has laws or judicial decisions that define or interpret terms like person or child to include a fetus or an embryo in civil and criminal laws. And includes things like wrongful death of a child, trust in estates, child abuse and neglect. And, after Roe was decided, we saw states passing largely symbolic legislation recognizing the quote unquote sanctity of fetal life. And now without Roe, these laws take on a dangerous new meaning to the rights of pregnant people. And there was a new frontier that was breached in the state legislative cycle this year. 13 states introduced bills that misappropriated equal protection and civil rights language to protect the rights of fetuses and embryos. 15 states introduced abortion as homicide bills, and 12 of those implicated the death penalty. So the mask has been torn off in terms of the narrative of not wanting to, punish women or, punish people and patients who get abortions. And even though none of these laws passed, they serve to desensitize voters for future attempts. They'll just keep coming back and back and back because they're pretty relentless. And then the other way this comes up, in the meantime, to keep normalizing this idea that legal rights should be endowed on fertilized eggs and embryos and fetuses is by proposing policies that seem innocuous or desirable, like tax credits for the unborn or child support from conception or carpool lane access for pregnant people, right? And again, it's all serving to normalize the idea of fetuses having separate legal rights. And, the other things at stake here are things like IVF and contraception, forced medical intervention, like, forced C-sections. And on the flip side, denying life and health-saving abortion care, contrary to the EMTALA federal statute, right, to save someone's health and life. And 29 states ignore people's advance directives for end-of-life decisions. So if you're brain dead, you can be hooked up to machines after death, whether you wanted to or not, whether your family wants that or not.
We saw that with Adriana Smith. And, what I think is so interesting about that particular case is that I think in a way, both sides got it wrong. People on both sides got it wrong, right? Because a lot of pro-choice people were saying, oh, she should get an abortion. She wants an abortion. She should get an abortion. And that's not what her family said. Her family said that they wanted the choice, right? And that's really what it's about.
Right.
Right.
They wanted a say. And, if you're pregnant, you should have a say.
That actually segues into the follow-up question that I had, which is, it feels like in many ways the push to advance the rights of developing pregnancies at whatever stage is a return to almost a legal coverture around pregnant people, or this idea that people who with the capacity to become pregnant and give birth are almost wards of the state in some degree once that reproductive capacity takes hold. And I'd just like your thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there are a couple of states where you could be civilly committed if you're posing a danger to your fetus, right? So
Wisconsin has that law, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm. So you're absolutely right. But I also want to make sure that we talk about the federal creep that's happening. Mm-hmm. It's not just the state creep.
Not just the guy, but the federal personhood creep.
Right, because fetal personhood is all over Project 2025. And the Trump administration has been very stealthy being on the bandwagon, because we know that direct attacks on abortion is very unpopular. But in late July, the Senate just confirmed a Trump judicial nominee, Josh Devine, who's the former Missouri Solicitor General. He's a staunch anti-abortion and fetal personhood proponent. He's been advocating and trying to undermine the Missouri ballot initiative. And now he is on, lifetime appointment on the Eastern and Western District of Missouri in the federal court. So he's on the pipeline for higher court appointments. And at the Justice Department, Josh Craddock has been hired as Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Office of Legal Counsel. And he identifies as an abortion abolitionist. He's called for criminal penalties for abortion patients. He supports fetal personhood. And so this expansion has been happening at the federal level too. And let's not forget, earlier in the year, in January, the executive order that was an attack on trans people that included, the direction to federal agencies to recognize only two binary genders as male and female from the moment of conception.
Right.
Congress is in the act too. There's a bill that gets introduced over and over. Luckily, it hasn't gone very far. But the Life at Conception Act, that gets introduced every year. And I just want to say one thing, the big fugly betrayal bill, right? That's cutting healthcare, food, housing, education. We should anticipate there's going to be more and more adverse pregnancy outcomes for which the solution will be the carceral system. So all of this really ties together.
Speaking of carceral solutions, given the amount of detainees that are being held in swamps, essentially with no running water and very little food and being chained and forced to eat like animals, this whole idea of who is a person is deeply connected to the Trump administration's attacks on birthright citizenship and his efforts to make sure that there are no quote unquote anchor babies, which is a terribly offensive term for people who are born in this country to undocumented people. Can you walk our audience through how?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said at the top of the podcast, that the 14th Amendment uses the language that all persons born in the U.S. are recognized as citizens. And this has been the consistent interpretation for a very, very long time, right? And ignoring this, President Trump issued this executive order in January, basically telling federal agencies to change the way they determine birthright citizenship by taking into account the parent's immigration status at the time of a child's birth. And by the way, the other part of the history of when the 14th Amendment was adopted is that there were Chinese laborers here building our railroads. And Congress was very clear that the 14th Amendment, the word persons, would also grant their children citizenship. And it's become, very handy for European, people of European descent who come to this country and anybody else. So the perverse irony is that while the right is fighting for due process and equal protection for fertilized eggs and fetuses, the 14th Amendment is just being unmoored from history and reality to justify the reimposing of a patriarchal binary white supremacist order. So, immigrants and sometimes citizens are being targeted and deported without due process. Trans children have been deemed to not have equal protection rights to access gender-affirming care. The Dobbs decision overturned women's 14th Amendment liberty rights, voting rights, affirmative action, other civil rights measures that are meant to address the historic and ongoing discrimination of Black and Brown people and women and LGBTQ people, people with disabilities. It's all being dismantled, right? Yeah. And this has been a project since Brown versus Board of Ed ordered desegregation in schools. But now there's a particular kind of demographic freakout in America, with the accompany panic of lowering birth rates, especially among middle-class white women. So deportation and pronatalism are the perceived solutions. And this is not the first time in the history of our country, right? We've seen eugenics and forced sterilization to address prior demographic freakouts. And it's not just women of color, but poor white women and people with disabilities. And it's all part of this well-worn authoritarian playbook. Pushing white women back into the house to have babies, be responsible for the domestic sphere. The man goes and gets the bacon. And then the entire erasure of people who are deemed undesirable within this hierarchy, and including the use of the police state.
Yeah.
If it includes forcing people to give birth, letting more pregnant people die, well, too bad, so sad, because good mothers should want to be self-sacrificing. And that's kind of where we are.
And only certain people in that space as well. Imani and I have talked about on this podcast how Buck versus Bell is one precedent that the court may not ever want to overturn, given the political space that it occupies right now.
Oh, absolutely. And Buck versus Bell was about a case of a young, poor white woman, who was sterilized against her consent. And the main opinion said, 3 generations of quote unquote imbeciles is enough. And she was a young woman who became pregnant because she was raped by someone in the household where, she was because of foster care. So let's remember those circumstances.
Also, I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about, with that quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes about 3 generations of, quote, imbeciles being enough, we need to tie that to the current attacks on mental health care.
Absolutely.
And RFK Jr.'s, Make America Healthy Again plan, which apparently means that my ADD riddled ass is going to be in a wellness farm somewhere, picking fruit and trying to just work through it, via nature. Do you have any concerns that that policy is going to end up worsening things?
We should be concerned about many things, that including, right? Because it's not evidence-based. None of this is evidence-based. They're just like making stuff up, right? And it's really dangerous to all of us, to people of color, to women, to LGBTQ people. It's really dangerous. It's just not based in reality. And before we move on about the executive order, the other thing I just want to say that what was interesting about the Supreme Court's decision in Trump versus Casa is that they didn't actually talk about the underlying issue of birthright citizenship. What they basically did was allow the Trump administration to just move forward with its power grab, right? Because the lower courts have been really good at issuing injunctions to just stop them in their tracks from, stepping over the Constitution. And what the court did was say to the lower courts is like, you're like extended well beyond your authority by issuing these national injunctions. So stop it, right? And so clearing the way for the Trump administration to implement a clearly unconstitutional executive order, they did leave the door open to challenge using a nationwide class action, which the advocates were smart and fast, and they did. And there's currently another injunction in place, which is great. But we're just going to have to see how this goes, because we should expect the Trump administration to challenge the class certification.
What a mess.
It is a mess.
I mean, truly, what a mess. And we've done a little bit of a walkabout here in terms of the 14th Amendment and advancing fetal rights, whether at the state or federal level, that we've seen, and noted that these were, situations that predated Dobbs, right? They existed while Roe was in place, and ostensibly there were 14th Amendment rights for people who could become pregnant. What's the antidote here to advancing fetal rights? Do we need an equal rights amendment, as some advocates have suggested? Is there more than one antidote? Where do we go? Our listeners often want action items. How can we and they push back?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that you just mentioned, Jess, that I want to underscore is that this has been happening before, during, and after Roe, with this building up of this idea of fetal rights. And with the expansion, criminalization has increased. So the first year after Dobbs, we released a report called, Pregnancy and Criminalization, and we documented the highest number of pregnancy criminalization cases in any one year. Granted, our methodology has been improving too, right? But we still know it's an undercount, but we have seen pregnancy criminalization accelerating. But what can we do? There's a lot we can do. And this question really motivates me, because we're getting up every day to continue to reaffirm pregnant people's rights. One thing we can do is pregnancy justice provides and supports robust criminal legal defense at the state level. And we found that even in states with the worst laws, it's possible to get charges dropped with robust criminal defense, because sometimes they make stuff up. Because they don't think they don't believe anybody's looking.
Cops lie.
It's true. And we can challenge the junk science, and we can challenge the misuse and mischaracterization of state law. So we can't make it easy. So that's one thing that we do. And we're also working to create good precedents in state courts. We had a really great recent win in the Maryland State Supreme Court, where a woman who suffered a stillbirth at home, she was convicted for second-degree murder for 30 years and sentenced to 30 years.
What?
So, and to make the case for murder of a born baby, the prosecutor showed that the woman had earlier researched abortion information, she didn't get prenatal care, and she kept her pregnancy private, to argue that she must have murdered a live child, right?
And that's the intent that she had.
Right. And the prosecutor, made these fetal personhood arguments. And we submitted an amicus brief saying that, look, you can't use these sexist gender stereotypes of how pregnant women are supposed to behave, and the concept of that fetuses have legal rights, which is contrary to Maryland law, as a basis for prosecution. And luckily, the court agreed and threw out the conviction and ordered a new trial without relying on this prejudicial and non-relevant evidence. So good news on that. And we're taking that decision on the road, believe me, in other state courts. You mentioned ERAs. Yes, it's important to fight for laws that provide protections for pregnant people and that repeal fetal rights laws. So last year, New York passed the Equal Rights Amendment to the state constitution. It explicitly included protections for pregnant people, pregnancy outcomes, and the autonomy in reproductive health care to make one's own decisions. And other states, just Colorado in 2022 passed a Reproductive Health Equity Act that had a lot of similar protections, right? Rejecting fetal personhood and establishing that pregnant people have fundamental rights to continue pregnancy, give birth, or have an abortion, and to make their own decisions. And other states have as well. And pregnancy justice, we're going to continue to fight for the legislative session in 2026. We're working with partners to release a proactive state policy blueprint, for state and local elected officials. We're advocating for the repeal of harmful fetal personhood language. And at the federal level, we're working with partners to sound the alarm about these harmful appointments, like Judge Josh Devine, who support fetal personhood. And the final thing I'll mention is, the need to change and amplify the narrative. So we conducted research with the National Women's Law Center. And from that research, we know that the more people learn about the push to grant separate legal rights to embryos and fetuses, people really hate it. People across demographics really don't like it. So bringing attention to what's happening, like on this podcast, and also supporting, we support people who want to tell their own stories if they've been affected by these policies, to be able to tell these stories. And we work with medical professionals to talk about the junk science and the overblown claims on fetal harm. So all of this is really important to bring, actual evidence and facts and change the narrative. Because again, people don't like these laws once they learn about them.
And that I really want to underscore that point that you just made about the fact that these laws, this whole idea is so unsavory and unpopular for folks, and connect it back to Colorado, because we do in the Reproductive Health Equity Act here in Colorado, advocates pushed really hard for provisions that insulated the state from future personhood claims. Mm-hmm. And that was in large part thanks to the work that folks in your organization had done, and the groundwork laid by organizations like Pregnancy Justice. And our listeners may not understand that Colorado had a fetal personhood push on its ballot in 2008. In the Obama years, right? And so Colorado is really on the forefront in trying to make that a push. And it was decades of work by advocates to lay the groundwork. So this is not something that is one electoral cycle solve, is it, Lourdes?
Oh, not at all. In fact, Colorado had to push back numerous really harmful ballot initiatives. Mm-hmm. So the advocates on the ground there became very adept at pushing back and fighting against this and laying the groundwork. And so it has been a decades-long fight, and it just shows what you can do when you're not just on defense, but that you're fighting proactively.
Yeah, I love that point, because so much of the abortion rights movement is playing defense, reacting to what anti-choicers are doing. And so it's lovely to see that organizations like Pregnancy Justice have been very proactive in not just obviously defending pregnant people, but also informing the population about how pregnancy has been criminalized for decades and who's been yoked up and why. And I think that's really important work that you guys do.
Thank you so much.
Well, this has just been a lovely conversation. I love the 14th Amendment. I love talking about personhood. Obviously, it's terrible, but it's one of those just kind of nerd out things that I have. So I really want to thank you, Lourdes, for joining us today.
Yeah.
We've been talking to Lourdes Rivera of Pregnancy Justice.
I feel so much smarter.
I feel so much smarter, right? I absolutely do. And honestly, fetal personhood is that brass ring. I think, Jess and I have been saying that for a while, and you've just heard Lourdes, basically repeat it, that they're not going to stop until, as soon as a man looks at another person, that person might get pregnant with just like a loving look in their eye. It's really, and I make jokes. We make jokes because that's how we survive, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing this podcast after 8 years. But it's really critical to be able to talk to such knowledgeable, powerful people like you. And I appreciate you taking the time to come on to the show.
Well, it's been my pleasure. And you all are just doing a great service in educating the public about all of these issues. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. And please come back anytime. I know just the connections between surveillance by the state, pregnancy outcomes, the just overreach of government right now in family spaces, the resurgence of parental rights. We've got Jonathan Mitchell out there trying to certify a class action of all future dads in the country. Like, it's bananas, Lourdes. I feel like we will need your clarity as we move through this next season of stuff.
Yeah, a lot of stuff.
What it feels like.
A lot of stuff to shovel.
This has just been a delight. Thank you again for joining us. And to our listeners, do you want to tell our listeners how they can find you if you're on social media, if you do that sort of thing, or maybe Pregnancy Justice has an Instagram that people should follow?
Well, yes, thank you. You can find us on Instagram on Pregnancy Just. So that's at Pregnancy Just, as well as our website, pregnancyjusticeus.org. So see you there.
If you want to talk to either Jess or I about the contents of this interview or anything else, really, you can find us both on Blue Sky. I'm Angry Black Lady. Jess is Hegemommy, HEGEMOMMY.BSKY.social. You should follow RewireNewsGroup.com on Blue Sky. And you should also follow Rewire News Group on Instagram and on TikTok. Our social team is really cranking out some amazing stuff. And on that note, what are we going to do, Jess?
We're going to see you on the tubes, folks.
We're going to see you on the tubes, folks.